Hi, this is Kurt Doolittle, the Propertarian Institute. This is the follow-up to our talk on ancestral lands. During the interview, Roman and I digressed a bunch of times because actually it's a pretty interesting subject, and so we felt that I needed to sort of collapse this and get to sort of more analytical statement at the end. The question we have is, do I have the right to ancestral lands? And now this is a controversial topic, and it's Don Finnegan's suggestion that we pick up this controversial topic because honestly he wants me to be as controversial at all. And as a good marketer, I know that controversy is actually a really good way of getting attention. So I thought I'd address it, despite the fact that this isn't really a question of propertarianism; it's a question of aristocratic egalitarianism. So I'm going to save that for my closing statement as to why that's true. But even though it's a controversial topic and it's really more of aristocratic egalitarian, we can get a propertarian answer out of it. When I was working on this script, it actually took me a long time. I'm going to cover it fairly quickly, but it took me a long time to be sure I had it right. I found I had quite a bit more work to do. And though interestingly enough, I can answer the problem of ancestral lands. Just because we can find criteria for something doesn't mean there are conditions under which the criteria can be met. In other words, it may be possible to restore ancestral lands, but it's also a very, very high bar. So the first topic I need to address is the problem of fuzzy language, which is endemic to philosophy. To do that, one of the things I've tried to add quite a few constraints in propertarianism to political argument, and one of them is that we tend to talk in terms of ideal types, which we would call in philosophy reductio arguments. And so we try to reduce things to first principles using very clear, very simple examples, so that at human scale, in other words, within the abilities of human mind without assistance from outside instruments, we can sort of make a decision or decide between different possibilities. Well, propertarianism asks us to be a little more like economists and to think not in ideal types but in spectrums, because it's a little harder to fall prey to the problem of scale, which is something you hear me talk about in propertarianism all the time, or at least, excuse me, in operationalism and testimonial truth, as a problem, because most of the problems we encounter is changing from this human scale, our perception limits and abilities to human scale, and what happens when we breach human scale. So in propertarianism, I like to get people to stop working with ideal types so much and look at the spectrum. So I want to talk about rights as a spectrum. Well, the first kind of right is one we can actually possess. It's a legal right. It's contractual. You and I go into a contract together, and we write a contract. And in societies develop norms, and those norms determine the scope of property rights. They're enforceable by the society under the contract. So when I get a contractual right, when I agree with something, that means that I can appeal to a judge, a third party, a head man, whoever, to resolve this conflict for us, and that the corporation, the body politic, has agreed to resolve this for us. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't things that outside of what the corporation body politic agrees to enforce. We could just do that by gentleman's handshake, but that's not a right necessarily as so much as it a promise or obligation, because it's not enforceable. So when we say I have a right, that's existential, right? I mean, I can prove that exists by some sort of contractual documentation, words, promise, handshake, or norm, just norm alone, and I can go to somebody and ask for enforcement of it. So that's an in-group constraint, right? That's a contract right within a contract that already exists with the people I live and work with, and that kind of thing. But when we talk about a moral right, people tend to take this contractual right or the principle that it's right and just right, which is a normative concept, and they try to say that it goes to outgroup members. So I have a moral right beyond the scope of contract or of norms to people who are of outgroup members. And but you can't have a right because you haven't got a contract with them for cooperation. You certainly don't have a contract with them for enforcement. So all you really have, what you're really saying is I demand this right in order to cooperate with you. You can't have a moral right. You can say, for me to create the cooperation, in other words, a condition of morality, I require this right. And so that there are sort of existential, necessary, minimum, natural rights that you can demand. But to say that these things exist independently of an agreement for them is impossible. You have to have an exchange to have a right. To have it, you have to have an exchange with somebody. So you can just demand it. You can say it's necessary, or whether you have it or not is dependent upon the volition of the other parties involved. The third idea is a further extension of it, which is a total outgroup constraint, which is the people who you don't even hope to have an agreement with. They're the people that are your opponents, enemies, however you want to talk about it. And to them, you're saying this isn't a contractual in-group normative right, a contractual legal right. There's an extension of the norms, nor is it a moral right in the sense that we're making the offer or the demand for a right or the offer of exchange of this right in order for mutually beneficial cooperation. What we're saying is that I am right and just in using violence to enforce restitution of any sort that's committed against me. And so that's a functional ability that's not that's a claim. And so when you make this claim, what you're saying is I'm threatening you. I'm threatening you, I'm threatening anybody else who gets involved in this. So when you say, I am in the right to use violence, you mean, I'm in the right to use violence here. Moreover, if you interfere, I'm in the right to use it against you too. So this is the spectrum of when we say this wonderful word right, which starts out being an in-group concept, and it gets grown to the extension of first our in-group, then in-group moral, then group legal codes, then out-group potential moral rights, and then out-group of demands or threats. The right starts going all the way from something warm and fuzzy inside within our group that we agree to, all the way to its original purpose, which is it's a threat. I mean, that's what property is, right? When I acquire something, humans are acquisitive. We must acquire things. That's why we can act and plan and do things. We're acquisitive. We need to acquire. We acquire all sorts of things: relationships, friends, caretaking, insurance, material goods, status, so we can mates, children, offspring, time. We have all these things we have to sort of acquire. And so if I act to acquire them, and I do that without violating the contract for cooperation with other people in my group, which means I'm not engaging in free riding or parasitism or theft, then this thing's mine. We've agreed that this thing's mine. But even if we haven't agreed on it, because I did all that stuff, I agree to use my violence to determine it's mine. And just because we want to reduce conflict with each other and settle things amicably, because this violence is extremely harmful to everyone, it tends to breed feuds and all this other stuff, we tend to find judges or headmen in any polity in order to resolve these conflicts. And if we don't find judges to resolve these things, what we do is we develop states or authorities that suppress retaliation and enforce behavior. So we really have enforced standards of behavior. So we either really have the coverage of law, which is, in other words, we either suppress things by the courts, and then we provide a vent to conflict and resolution, conflict and restitution, or we take things the other direction, which is we create authorities and we impose rules upon people and punish them if they don't meet them. The authority punishes them, and we impose limits to retaliation, even for things that we would defend if we had our choice to. So that's the difference between a libertarian and an authoritarian state. A libertarian state suppresses all immorality by law, so that all resolutions of conflicts are voluntary and organically evolve, and the opposite is tyranny, where in which you are sort of the only thing that's permissible are those which you were told to be permissible, and retaliation is impossible on the outside of it. We humans develop both kinds of cultures. But anyway, when you say right, I mean, a right exists under. I mean, I suppose right exists under both the authoritarian and libertarian models. But in that sense, that we're talking here, when you say, "Do I have a right to my ancestral lands?" You're a right against who? In-group members? Well, I mean, I don't know what they have to say about it. They're not the problem. Potential out-group members? Maybe you're telling that your peers and the other civilizations in your neighborhood. You're saying, I'm right and just in doing this, and you're saying this as to the people who might impose upon you, might try to conquer you, or have conquered you and taken your things, that you're issuing a threat against them. That's your right to issue a threat. And that furthermore, you're saying that anybody interferes with the exercise of my doing the right and just restitution of my property is also a conspirator in this act. So when we say rights, and whether rights are existential, we have to know whether we're saying something is a normative right we've agreed to, a legal right we've agreed to, a offer of rights, a natural, which is usually reducible to some sort of natural right, but maybe not, and functional ability, a threat was that we are in the right to restore our property. So anyway, I hope I've clarified a little bit this problem of fuzzy language of rights. So that concludes my section on rights. Now that we've gotten over the fuzzy problem of rights, I want to get over to the criteria for the repossession of ancestral lands. And like I said, these criteria are fairly challenging to meet. It doesn't mean those things aren't possible to meet. It just means that they're difficult to meet. So the first thing I'm going to put out is, just as I said, well, there's a spectrum that I want to address rights over, which is a population. There's a spectrum we have to deal with here in the restoration of lands called time, right, which is persistence. So the first condition is condition of existence. Existence is persistence. If you don't persist, you don't exist. That's why we have that's what to exist means. So in order to exist, the people have to have formed a corporation. Now, a corporation is a body of people, usually kin, but you can gradually alter the meaning of kin through interbreeding over time. But you must have formed a corporation to produce, norms, rules, laws, myths, rituals, and those norms, those normative rules, in other words, the shareholder agreement for participation in that group has to persist today. So we have to have corporate persistence. The second condition of existence is that your corporate exists in sufficient numbers for the productive use of the land, its capital institution. This is the evidence of your institution. You can't just existence. You can't just say, well, I'm the last remaining soul and therefore I'm heir to the continent of Atlantis. You can't make productive use of that land, and if there's just one of you, you can't be a corporation anymore. But it's pooling assets to form a commons, and that's the purpose of a corporation. So let's understand where corporations come from. We tend to talk about corporations as this capitalist thing that was invented. It's just the opposite. A corporation is what we've been doing for all of Western history. We've been developing a corporation, because what is a corporation? What's a government? A government is a thing that constructs commons that are not consumable by individuals. In other words, they're a requirement that you produce to commons. The same thing a corporation is. A corporation is a thing where we all pool our assets, but we're all forbidden from privatizing them. Matter of fact, the conditions of pooling our assets is that all merits are distributed to corporation members. In other words, you can't privatize anything. That's different in private and corporate. So when we invented corporations, we had been so successful at corporations, we took this idea and we took it out farther. We wanted even more instances where we could create even more kinds of commons, where we could outlaw privatization of commons, not just here in this town square, but in any sort of organization we wanted to build. And that was one of our greatest advances, was transforming the body politic as a corporation to subcorporations that could be used for in smaller and smaller, more precise ways to allow us to cooperate and by overcoming the desire of each of us to privatize common gains and socialize private losses to the commons. So that's what a commons does, and that's one of the things that governments are useful for, is that the market's really, really good, you know. You can cooperate with people you don't know in the market, and we can do all sorts of great things, but when I compete and you compete, somebody gets a customer, one of us sort of lost out on the opportunity, and that provides us with good incentives to change. But this same incentive to competition and privatization and socialization of losses was very similar right there to the market. The competition doesn't work because people won't contribute to a commons if they think it's going to be privatized by others. This is why homogeneous societies are redistributive and heterogeneous societies are not, because heterogenes are competitors. You may have an institutional system over them, but they're still your kinship competitors, your economic competitors, your status competitors, your competitors on every single front, government or no. Our governments are means of prohibiting the consumption of commons, and that's a corporate function, and our corporations are a means of prohibiting consumption of commons that were pooled together for collective good. And so we've got a lot of corporations, and one of the best things we've been able to do is just to construct a lot of them and to have them be enforceable. So in other words, you still must have a body politic, some sort of corporation that can go and reclaim its assets and put it to productive uses. Otherwise, there's no claim of corporation extent whatsoever. That's easy to consider. I mean, if you bankrupt a company today, there's no company left to go after reclaim its assets or do anything on behalf of the company, right? Well, if people don't exist anymore, you can't. No, there's nothing to go claim stuff on behalf of. The third condition is the condition of transformation. This is very Lockean. We all know the Lockean condition. We transform the land, and then it becomes yours. Well, for people who aren't that familiar with libertarian property rights, the idea here is that if I bring something into being, we call it homesteading, and that takes it back to the Lockean's very simplistic version of, we're the first users of land, and we transform land, and then we can farm it, then it's ours. This is a simple principle, but it equates to anything we bring into being using our own efforts that didn't exist before. I mean, in theory, farmland, unsettled land that nobody occupies is brought under settlement by man, turned into farmland, is in fact transformed, and it's made from something that isn't into something that is. And so this land that's converted for productive use, and that's the issue here, it's converted for productive use. It's not that you just stand on it and sit on it or graze your cows on it. You've converted it by investing in it for productive use, then you've actually transformed this into your property. So you have to have the condition of transformation is you have to have transformed the land. You can't just have wandered over it. And in doing this, it's got to be a durable fashion, right? You have the question of whether it's not just like an orchard you can walk away from and resettle, or a pile of rocks. You have to have put something in there that is durable, like physical alterations, into inserting irrigation, rerouting rivers, felling trees, quarrying rocks, building buildings, building dams, building bridges, building trade routes, building warehouses, and finally building great architecture and getting up to monuments. So the condition, and I want to get into that because each of these things has different conditional values. So what do these things mean? Well, if I'm just putting an orchard, that's a me and you thing, or I'm grazing, or I'm building my farmhouse. But if I go out and I build institutions, informal institutions, I've built trade routes, contracts, I've built literacy and the arts, I've built a body of laws, norms, I've built, I've created enough examples of cooperation that I can do what is really pretty crazy, is to build buildings, but maybe earthworks or changing the course of land. But then I get to the thing where I've been so successful, you and I have been so successful with our corporation that we can afford to build monuments. And our most common monuments, of course, temples and churches, but we get up to things where we're extending the temple and church to examples like, I think about Lviv, the great opera house here, or the United States, France or England, where you have the Parliament building, which is gorgeous on the Thames, or you have the King's Residence at Versailles, or the White House in America. These are not only institutions, formal institutions of state, but they're monuments of state. They're claims on the territory. They're examples of wealth. They're demonstration of intergenerational investment in holding that, in the great sacrifices that it takes to hold land. The reason people don't have land is because they won't make the sacrifices to hold it. I mean, that's why they don't have land. So if you have land, you've made great sacrifices. You've built great institutions. You've become a people who's ostensibly moral to do this. Of course, you can do it by robbing and stealing too. But I mean, I'm actually talking. It's pretty hard to make talk about justifying the restoration of ancestral lands if you've actually stolen the stuff. So I'm not. That's sort of a logical non sequitur, which is why I'm avoiding that. I'm not assuming something there. I'm just avoiding talking about it because it's unnecessary. So once you get to monuments, you've really said, not only have I made good use of this land, I've improved mankind. I've made a durable mark on it. I've set up and I've proven by the wealth and evidence of our actions that we are able to construct very expensive luxuries like monuments expressly to claim it. And one of the things I like about monuments, or I think it's really important to bring out, is look at the value of a monument. It doesn't matter if it's a big black rock in the desert in Saudi Arabia, or if it's the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum, the Roman Colosseum, the Egyptian pyramids, Temple of Athena, Parthenos. I mean, it doesn't matter which thing it is. Building monuments turns out to be an incredibly good intertemporal investment, and it's one of the greatest pieces of evidence that you and your people, the corporation, it's your body, has added to mankind, added to the earth, transform and put investment inside of it. So once you have monuments, you're saying I own this, right? And once you own this, you can prove it. I mean, that's not a condition anymore. It's a lasting intertemporal evidence of your possession, your success, your morality. So your morality in the sense that not an abstract, goofy Christian good, but in the sense that you have fostered enough human cooperation to create enough wealth to afford to build a thing like a monument. So that's the condition of intertemporal value. The fifth condition has to be theft. I mean, you can't just walk away from something and come back 1,000 years later and say, well, this was mine, my ancestors at one point. Well, no, I mean, you and if you just abandon something, I'm sorry, then you've just abandoned it. If, however, it was stolen from you, and stolen can happen by propertarian, the full spectrum of means available that we address available to humans that we address in propertarianism, which could be, it can be happen by violence, it can happen by theft, it can happen by fraud, it can happen by religious conversion, it can happen by genetic evolutionary displacement. So you can have things stolen from you a lot of ways, but it can't be abandoned, because when you abandon something, you're saying I'm no longer using this in production. If you're no longer using it in production, then you no longer have a claim on it. And if you no longer have a claim on it, then it's up for other people to have. This is the condition. Otherwise, human cooperation isn't impossible, really. Or we just have to go around killing each other for incalculable reasons because nothing's usable in the planet, because we're never sure who has control of it. The last one is the Propertarian condition. You probably haven't heard before, which is because the progressives will hate this, but it's actually true, is the condition of non-regression. So you have to possess objective Propertarian moral superiority in the present, which means that you can't you can't be a low trust, highly corrupt, violent polity and go over and take the institutions of a high trust, highly cooperative, advanced commercial polity, even if it's for the purpose of restoration, because you're a people of a lower moral caliber. This is the problem I have with Russian expansion, is that I'm actually kind of fond of Russians. I think they're adorable, and they're as a simpler version of our past, example of our past. I think they're fantastic. On the other hand, when they get their stuff together and they become a moral people, they can join the rest of the adults in the world. But until that, the Russians have done more murder and damage and criminality to humankind than anybody other than the Chinese and the Great Plague. And the Great Plague wasn't even an intentional human invention. So I'm not really big on Russian expansion. I think they've caused the people of Europe and Eastern Europe to suffer enough for all of eternity. And so once Russia determines that they're going to turn into a high trust, productive, cooperative polity with low corruption, they can maybe join the rest of the civilized world. But till then, they just need to stay out of Europe, and Europe needs to keep a wall around them because they're still barbarians. So the condition of non-regression. Now this is actually a really high bar because Propertarianism places a high constraint on you. I mean, it says that morality isn't subjective; it's objective. You may say, well, lower morality suits our people. Well, a lower morality suits everybody in the short term. A higher morality suits everybody in the longer term. So you may have the opinion that you're more moral. I'm sure that everybody thinks they're special, but it's not your opinion. It's completely irrelevant. It's factual or not. Either you suppress more free riding or you suppress less of it. You suppress more unethical, criminal, unethical, immoral, conspiratorial, and invasive behavior than the next guy, or you don't. Trust is more enforceable and is more likely, and contracts are more enforceable, and either that's true or it isn't. There's no real there's no real opinion to be left open here. I mean, you might get into where we're just debating between the different Scandinavian models or something, the very privileged people on the earth, and those privileged people can get into all their high-mindedness all they want, but they get to be high-minded because they're living privilege, not because they're high-minded. It's an effect, not a cause. They have a luxury, not a construction. Lastly, the condition of non-regression was a 6th. The 7th point was condition of enforceability. So you got to actually be able to do this. I mean, it's all well and good to make the case that you have a condition that you think this is right and just, but you actually have to work to do it. You can't ask other people to do it for you. I mean, other people might help you, but you can't ask people to do it for you. So you can't expect people to walk away from it. And I just find this a whole lot of conversation. Either fight for it to believe in, or you've abandoned it. If you're not fighting for it, then you've abandoned it. If you've abandoned it, it's not yours anymore. So these 7 criteria bring up the question of restoration. Well, land. The problem with is that once you've built up this unique entity called a territory that's your people's ancestral land, and transformed it for the purposes of production, done such a good job of transforming human beings for the purpose of production, that you've been able to create physical transformations to the land, and all the way up to monuments, demonstrating that you have enough excess wealth there to be able to create monuments. That land has become unique. Land isn't fungible. So I don't really know how this can be done. I mean, I suppose land is divisible, so you can say, well, we'll make a contract with you and whatever, and you can get this piece and we'll get this piece. And I think this is divisible, but it's dependent on permanent settlement of the differences. Otherwise, I mean, what you're doing is you're not actually settling anything. You're just prolonging the conflict. And so my view is that either you get a permanent settlement of the conflict, or there's no point in doing it, because all it does is empower your enemies. Is restitution an alternative? Well, I mean, if you say, well, is restitution the same as restoration? Well, it's not, because land isn't fungible. So if I can't restore you to land, I can't really pay you restitution. There's no alternative. Well, and this is a problem, because people say, well, I want monetary restitution. Well, I mean, can I get restitution out of all of Freud's descendants for making up his pseudoscience of psychology? Can I get this is. I mean, you can't privatize I mean, if the purpose of a corporation is to prevent privatization, restitution is just liquidation, right? I mean, liquidation of something, and it is privatizing it. So I'm not going to go into this whole. I'm taking too long on this already, but I don't want to go into saying, well, that was a corporation. The corporation still persists. If we liquidate the corporation, that's privatizing it, and the purpose of a corporation is with intergenerational restoration. I mean, I understand that if you want to restore the corporation and have it persist, but the minute you privatize it, you turn it into liquid capital, then it's not the corporation's also been eliminated. So to me, I think this is just a plea for personal gain, not a plea for corporeal gain or corporate gain. So I think that's probably off the table too. So I really think the only possibility here is restoration. If you can't get restoration, or if you don't suit restoration, I think that's the only option really available. There's no other form of restitution. I mean, my argument would be the only restitution then is to get your guns together and go take your land back and do the same that was done to you, and then you've probably done the only form of restitution that's been possible is to mete out on the others what you have had bet out on you. So in summary, this is a pretty difficult problem. I mean, the problem of justifying one's sort of repossession of ancestral lands is actually a pretty high bar. I mean, it's not like a lot of people are going to be able to do that. I probably would argue that Kaliningrad is German and it needs to be retaken, and that's probably it. I mean, one of the people who keeps asking me, but what about Constantinople? I agree, Constantinople's probably legit. I don't know if the Iranians want their land back either, but I think that's probably there. Constantinople is certainly a huge investment, and I think the whole Greek area could probably be restored from what the Turks and Muslims did to it. Let's go to some aristocratic egalitarian extensions, which is the 8th criteria. I'd actually turn this around. Of course, selfish motives are one thing. You want your ancestral lands back, whatever, but you've already made the mistake of not being prepared to hold your ancestral lands. I mean, this is what happens, right? If you're selfish and you're weak and you don't put enough into your you don't put enough personal cost into holding your territory and it gets taken from you, then, I mean, realistically, most of the time you deserve it. I can't think of anything. I mean, that's probably if you're not able to hold your land, you're by definition acting immorally. So if you've acted immorally and displaced for your immorality, that's one thing. If you're acting morally and you're displaced by people who are more immoral than you, I think that's a different question altogether. But from an aristocratic egalitarian standpoint, my problem is punish the wicked. I mean, the only way to create a moral world is to make sure that you've prohibited all immoral actions, and you've frightened the daylights out of anybody who's thinking about doing them. So my argument it's not about whether you have a right to restore your ancestral lands if they've been taken from you. You have an obligation to mankind to restore your ancestral lands if they've been taken you by force, because all you're doing is fueling the fires of aggressive dispossession. And from an aristocratic standpoint, it's not whether you have a right. I mean, that's kind of a submissive view of the world anyway. Trying to excuse your behavior. It's not an excuse. If you've been dispossessed from your lands, you have an obligation to all mankind. You may have an obligation to your tribe or your corporation, but if you've been dispossessed from your land, your monuments, your history, and all of that by some other people, all you've done is fueled the fires of aggressive expansion around the world. If somebody comes into your town and sets up a new church, that's not a competing church. That's invasion. So if there's no different from if they try to convert your people, it's the same thing. So if somebody comes in and tries to replace your government, or tries to replace your military, or tries to replace your laws, tries to replace your norms, or tries to reallocate your property, it's all the same thing. These are all dispossessions. So your obligation. It's not that so much that you have the right to do something. It's that sure you have the right. That's kind of ridiculous. You have the right. If something's been stolen from you, have that right. The question is whether you're just a claimant, or you're an aristocrat and you're responsible. And if you're responsible, then your job is not to just claim a right. It's to understand that you have an obligation to use every resource at your disposal to correct the wrongs of your ancestors, to not be too selfish and too self-absorbed, too concerned with consumption, and then instead invest in the complete restoration of your lands. This is Kurt Doolittle from the Propertarian Institute. Thank you for sitting with me through this today. I've kind of enjoyed it as always. I hope it was helpful to you and it gave you some interesting things to talk about.